Tonight, we're not climbing into a trench, marching with a legion, or picking our way through some medieval plague pit. No, tonight we're stepping into a world of brass-rimmed spectacles, gaslit streets, and moral sermons, a place where respectability was everything, and vice had the good manners to hide in plain sight. We're going to take a long, steady walk through Victorian Britain, not to admire its architecture or debate its politics, but to quietly examine all the ways its citizens managed to get comfortably, and sometimes disastrously, intoxicated, sometimes with a doctor's blessing, sometimes with the grocer's help, and occasionally without ever meaning to at all. Before we decant the laudanum, light the cigar, pour the gin, or steep the tea, do me one small favor. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. If you prefer these stories without ads, you can join the Patreon. It's linked in the description. And if you listen to these in bed, consider using a pair of wireless sleep earbuds for enhanced immersion. They're comfortable, discreet, and designed for side sleepers. I've linked my favorite pair in the description. Now, lie back, get comfortable. Let's begin. Victorian Britain liked to think of itself as the height of moral restraint, a nation built on discipline, duty, and an almost competitive sense of self-denial. Yet, the average stroll through one of its great cities would make you wonder how anyone managed it without chemical assistance. Coal smoke hung in the air like a permanent weather system, settling in lungs, curtains, and teacups alike. The new railways whisked people between industrial hubs at unprecedented speeds, ensuring that no matter where you went, the smell of soot was there waiting for you. The empire's reach was expanding, the middle class was growing, and sermons thundered from pulpits about the virtues of sobriety, often to congregations who had just dosed their teething children with opium syrup so they'd stay quiet through the service. This was the golden age of respectable intoxication. Evangelical. Reformers and temperance leagues might rail against gin shops and beer halls, but a bottle from the chemist was another matter entirely. The difference between vice and medicine was mostly in the packaging and whether you had to stand at a bar to get it. Doctors and apothecaries dispensed stimulants, sedatives, and painkillers with professional gravity and minimal curiosity about what happened once the cork was out. The upper classes could denounce drunkenness in the street while sipping something far more potent in the drawing room, confident that its Latin label lent it moral cover. It was an era that preferred its indulgences to arrive in small glass bottles rather than tankards, and nothing embodied that preference better than laudanum. No other Victorian intoxicant blurred the line between cure and craving quite so elegantly. Laudanum was the Victorian household ghost, always present, rarely spoken of directly, and more welcome than one might publicly admit. Officially, it was a tincture of opium and alcohol, though the way most people described it was simply medicine. The proportions could vary depending on the maker, but its essence was always the same. A deep, reddish-brown liquid with a bitter, resinous tang, potent enough to quiet a cough, still a restless child, or make an aching body feel temporarily like somebody else's problem. It was cheap, legal, and required no prescription, the sort of thing you could buy as casually as tea or flour. Apothecaries sold it in polished bottles with neat labels. Chemists offered it alongside patent medicines of dubious origin, and even grocers kept a supply for those who didn't fancy the formality of the medical counter. Some bottles were plain and utilitarian, with little more than a cork and a paper wrap. Others were decorative enough to sit on a mantelpiece without raising suspicion. The versatility of laudanum was one of its most appealing qualities. A mother could dose a fretful infant without worrying that the neighbors would frown. It was, after all, recommended by doctors in the child-rearing manuals of the day. Clerks and shopkeepers could take a measured sip to quiet the thrum of overworked nerves without appearing disreputable. Artists and writers, prone to declaring themselves delicate or nervous, could take it in the name of inspiration, convinced it unlocked rooms in the mind otherwise barred by daylight. The chronically ill, of whom there were many in an age without. Antibiotics, used it to make their symptoms bearable, and sometimes to make life itself more so. It was the common denominator in households rich and poor, though the quality of the bottle, and perhaps the brandy it might be mixed with, betrayed the difference in class. The sensory experience was unmistakable. Laudanum did not flatter the palate. Its bitterness clung to the tongue, its earthy, resinous scent lingering in the air after the bottle was opened. But those who used it regularly knew the taste as a prelude to relief. Within half an hour, a slow warmth would spread through the body, smoothing the sharper edges of thought and sensation. The lungs felt less constricted, the joints less inflamed, the mind less urgent. It did not so much erase discomfort as wrap it in thick cloth, muffling it until it no longer demanded attention. For some, that relief was purely physical. For others, it was emotional, a way to dim the lights on whatever personal gloom the day had brought. Respectability was the shield that kept laudanum from being classed alongside street corner vices. The same society that condemned gin as a moral failing could approve of laudanum as a medical necessity, provided it was taken under the guise of treatment. In polite conversation, it was for the digestion, for the nerves, or to help with sleep. Nobody mentioned how quickly the body learned to crave it, or how a dose taken for an honest headache might quietly become a nightly ritual. Dependency was a silent companion, and one that could be sustained for years without outward drama. The only signs might be a certain pallor, a softness in speech, or a tendency to drift off mid-afternoon in the armchair. The absence of regulation meant that strength varied considerably between suppliers, and a person's usual dose could be a treacherous concept when buying from a new source. An inexperienced user might find themselves far more sedated than expected, while a seasoned one might need to double their measure to achieve the same effect. In a time when even trained doctors argued over what constituted a safe quantity, accidental overdoses were quietly common. Newspapers occasionally reported on them, often with a tactful emphasis on misadventure rather than addiction, especially if the deceased had a reputable name. Laudanum's ubiquity blurred the moral lines that reformers like to draw. It was difficult to thunder about temperance when the same households that abstained from spirits kept a bottle of opium tincture in the kitchen drawer. That contradiction sat comfortably in Victorian culture, in part because laudanum did not provoke public disorder. It made no one rowdy in the street, and the only fights it caused were with the cork when one's hands shook. Its influence was quiet, domestic, and therefore largely invisible to those who did not wish to see it. Even so, the ghostly nature of laudanum use, its ability to hover in the background of daily life, did not mean it was without social consequence. For some families, it became the unseen force shaping household rhythms. Children who slept through the night because their mother did not wish to hear them cry. Letters left unwritten because the mind had slipped into a comfortable haze. Days spent indoors because the effort of leaving seemed too sharp-edged without a dose. It was a medicine, yes, but one that treated not just pain, but the will to do without it. Writers of the era occasionally hinted at its double life. In serialized novels, a character's laudanum bottle might be a sign of mysterious illness or of something more morally ambiguous. Medical journals debated its benefits and risks in dense, formal language, usually while recommending it liberally in the same breath. The most honest accounts came from addicts themselves, though they rarely used the word, who described the dull ache of needing it as worse than the ailments for which they first took it. For them, the cure was inseparable from the condition. That paradox, a socially endorsed, widely available substance capable of quiet ruin, was emblematic of Victorian attitudes toward intoxication in general. What mattered was not so much what the drug did, but how it was framed. Laudanum in the bedroom cabinet was medicine. Gin in the public house was vice. The dividing line was more about optics than chemistry, and everyone seemed content to leave it that way. In this way, liquid opiates were simply the latest chapter in a much older British relationship with chemical relief. Alcohol, after all, had been serving much the same purpose for centuries, with its own shifting moral status depending on the vessel it came in. And if laudanum had its respectable place in the parlor, gin was preparing to make a surprisingly polished return to the streets, not in the chaotic spirit of the 18th century gin craze, but in a new, regulated, and glittering form that Victorians could drink to with both enthusiasm and a clear conscience. If laudanum was the discreet shadow in the Victorian home, gin was its far louder, brighter cousin, a familiar spirit that had once nearly brought the country to its knees and was now making a carefully managed return. The 18th century had ended with the lingering hangover of the gin craze, when London's poor had drunk themselves into ruin on the cheapest, crudest distillations imaginable. Reformers and legislators had responded with licensing laws, taxes, and a public image campaign that cast gin as the ruin of morality and the working class alike. For decades, its name carried the same whiff of social decay as a slum cellar. But by the mid-19th century, the drink had been repackaged, quite literally, into something more elegant, respectable, and lucrative. Gin had been domesticated, scrubbed, up, and placed under glittering gaslights. The Victorian gin palace was nothing like the dark, seedy taverns of popular imagination. These new establishments were dazzling spaces designed to attract not just hardened drinkers, but anyone with a shilling and a taste for spectacle. Gas lamps blazed overhead, reflected 100-fold in great etched mirrors that lined the walls. Long, polished bars stretched across the room, their marble tops cool to the touch and ringed with the rhythmic clink of tumblers being set down and refilled. Brass fittings gleamed under the light, glassware sparkled, and the staff moved briskly, their sleeves rolled neatly to the elbow. There was a theatricality to it, as if every customer were a bit player in a grand performance of urban modernity. Gin itself had been softened for the Victorian palate. Old Tom gin, sweetened, gentler than the bone-dry London dry style that would dominate later, was popular in cocktails and punches, or taken neat for those who enjoyed the burn. The first sip carried the sharp, resinous taste of juniper followed by a mild sweetness that lingered in the mouth. It was a drink that could be dressed up in glass and garnish or swallowed in a plain measure at the bar. Whether accompanied by lemon peel and sugar or served without ceremony, it carried a faint ghost of its disreputable past, even in its new attire. The clientele was as mixed as the recipes. In working-class districts, gin palaces served as a more glamorous alternative to the pub, a place where men could drink standing at the bar and women could, if they dared, appear without being immediately marked as prostitutes. For many, these spaces were simply more comfortable than the cramped and smoky alehouses, offering better light, cleaner surroundings, and the illusion, sometimes more than the reality, of higher class. The marble counters and decorative cornices gave even a brief drink the air of an occasion. In middle-class circles, however, gin still carried a hint of moral suspicion. Temperance societies and evangelical reformers preached abstention with fervor, warning of the slow erosion of respectability and self-control. Pamphlets circulated with lurid accounts of drunkenness leading to poverty, violence, and ruin, often illustrated with crude woodcuts of slumped figures in alleyways. These moral warnings were not always exaggerated. Alcoholism did destroy lives in the Victorian city, but the divide between rhetoric and reality was stark. The same voices that condemned gin consumption among the poor often made quiet allowances for the genteel indulgence of wine at dinner, brandy for medicinal purposes, or champagne at a wedding. Respectability, as ever, was in the eye of the beholder. For the urban pleasure seeker, such moralizing was little more than background noise. A night in the gin palace was not necessarily about intoxication, though that was often the end result, but about participation in the life of the city. The bright lights and mirrored walls offered escape from the gloom of coal-smoked streets. Conversation flowed easily, the din of voices mixing with the occasional burst of laughter or the ringing of a till. The drinks themselves were often accompanied by snacks, oysters, biscuits, or slices of cold meat, reinforcing the sense that this was a place for both refreshment and sociability. Yet the memories of the gin craze had not entirely faded, and, A faint unease clung to the drink's reputation. The government kept a closer watch on licensing and taxation than in the previous century, ensuring that gin's revival did not slip into the chaos of uncontrolled production. The drink's return was carefully choreographed. It could be part of the respectable city, but only if it behaved itself. This balance between profit and public order, indulgence and restraint, mirrored the larger contradictions of Victorian social life. The sensory world of the gin palace was an intoxicant in itself. Stepping inside from a damp London evening, one was greeted by a blast of warm, perfumed air laced with the mingled scents of alcohol, tobacco smoke, and polished wood. The marble bar was cool beneath the hand, the tumbler's rim cold against the lips. Juniper's sharp bite cut through the sweetness, leaving a warmth that spread steadily through the chest. Around you, the glass clinked, coins changed hands, and mirrors reflected the restless shifting of bodies and faces. It was a space designed not just for drinking, but for feeling part of a larger, brighter whole. The public debate over gin's place in Victorian life was fierce, if often predictable. Temperance advocates insisted that moral decay was only ever a few drinks away, urging citizens to abstain entirely. They organized meetings, circulated petitions, and lobbied Parliament to restrict sales. On the other side, defenders of the gin trade, often with financial interests in the matter, spoke of the right to choose one's own pleasures and the social benefits of well-run establishments. They argued that the real problem lay not with the drink itself, but with those unable to handle it responsibly, a line of reasoning that neatly shifted the blame from industry to individual. For the working poor, the gin palace could be both a refuge and a trap. It offered light, warmth, and a sense of belonging in a city that often seemed indifferent to their existence. Yet, it could also be the place where wages vanished in a single evening, leaving little for rent or food. For women, the experience was doubly complex. Some found in the gin palace a rare space for public leisure. Others found it a site of judgment, harassment, or worse. Respectability for women was a delicate commodity, easily tarnished by the mere appearance of impropriety. This moral tightrope reflected the broader Victorian attitude toward intoxicants. They were acceptable in moderation, within certain social boundaries, and preferably under the cover of medical or ceremonial justification. Step outside those boundaries, and the same acts could transform from an innocent pleasure to a damning vice. Gin's transformation from the scourge of the poor to the polished drink of the city did not erase these contradictions. It merely clothed them in marble and brass. The glamour of the gin palace was real, but it was also fragile. Behind the mirrors and beneath the polished floors lay the same truths that had haunted the drink in its rougher days. Gin could dull pain, sharpen conviviality, or drain a life of its earnings and dignity. Its respectability was contingent, dependent on setting, company, and manner. The Victorians, ever adept at maintaining social illusions, were content to enjoy the spectacle without peering too closely into its darker corners. And yet, for all the managed elegance of the gin palace, there remained other forms of intoxication that were neither gilded nor domesticated. Some substances carried with them a deliberate aura of danger and exoticism that appealed precisely because it lay outside the boundaries of polite society. If gin had been tamed for public consumption, opium in its smokable form still lurked, in the shadows, promising a different kind of escape, one wrapped in whispered stories, dimly lit rooms, and the unmistakable smell of another world. To most Victorians, the idea of the opium den existed primarily in the fevered imagination of journalists, serialized novelists, and moral crusaders, places where pale-faced English youth stumbled in, exchanged their last shillings for a pipe, and emerged ruined, in body, mind, and possibly morals. In truth, what they were far more likely to emerge with was a mild headache, a lingering smell in their clothes, and the irritation of having paid too much for what was, in purely chemical terms, a less efficient dose than a cheap bottle of laudanum, but efficiency was never the point. The geography of these establishments, real or imagined, often overlapped with London's Chinese immigrant communities, which were concentrated in the dockside districts like Limehouse. It was there, amid warehouses of tea, silk, and porcelain, that small boarding houses and lodging rooms sometimes contained a space where opium could be smoked. To the average Victorian reader, the mere mention of a Chinese-run business was enough to set off a cascade of associations, exotic smells, inscrutable faces, and, if they'd been following the illustrated weeklies, the inevitable suggestion that something vaguely immoral was going on inside. This was a time when foreign could serve as both an adjective and an accusation, and opium smoking was a perfect vehicle for both. The fact that Britons themselves had been importing, taxing, selling, and politically defending the opium trade for decades was a detail usually left out of the moral outrage. The newspapers took great care to make the dens sound like another world. In breathless accounts, they were described as dimly lit caverns of vice, all carved rosewood furniture and embroidered silk cushions, where pale English girls were lured into a life of dependency by shadowy foreign hands. In the most lurid illustrations, a single red lantern might cast an unholy glow over a row of reclining figures, each with an oddly blissful expression, the sort of face usually reserved for sentimental deathbed scenes or advertisements for particularly comfortable armchairs. A lamp hissed in the foreground, the pipe's long stem pointing towards some mysterious brass bowl, and wisps of smoke curled upward as if to confirm the moral miasma. To a public primed by adventure fiction and missionary reports, this was less journalism than theatre, the vice of the East imported wholesale to the streets of London. In reality, much of the experience was quieter, smaller in scale, and markedly less theatrical. A working den consisted of a single upstairs room in a lodging house with a few low couches or bunks, some blankets that had seen better decades, and a table holding the basic smoking apparatus, the pipe, the lamp, a small container of prepared opium, and a few tools for heating and rolling it into pellets. The clientele was rarely the parade of doomed ingenues beloved by penny dreadfuls. More often, it was a mix of local dock workers, sailors on shore leave, and the occasional middle-class curiosity seeker who had read too much sensation fiction. Even the presence of Chinese patrons, while not uncommon, was hardly overwhelming. Many dens, in fact, catered primarily to non-Chinese customers, if only because locals had more money to spend and fewer connections to more discreet sources. The process itself was almost ceremonial, though the ceremony owed more to practicality than to mystique. The smoker would shape a small lump of opium paste onto the pipe's bowl, hold it over the lamp to vaporize it, and inhale slowly through the long stem. The lamp's hiss and the faint crackle of the paste heating were the loudest sounds in the room, aside from the occasional murmur of conversation. Exhalations were slow, measured, and heavy with a particular scent, sweet, tarry, and slightly cloying, the kind of smell that seemed to cling to fabric like a stubborn guest. There was a languid rhythm to the proceedings, a pace entirely unsuited to those in a hurry. This was not the abrupt jolt of gin or the creeping embrace of laudanum. Taken by the spoonful, it was a steady drift, a gradual surrender of muscular ambition and conversational energy. Sensory impressions lingered long after the smoke had thinned. The light in these rooms was often dim, not just from the lamps, but from windows covered with cloth to keep out drafts and perhaps to make the experience feel less like a rented room in Limehouse and more like something far away. The furnishings, where they were decorative at all, were usually practical items with a thin layer of Eastern ornamentation, a screen with a painted crane, a carved panel with chipped lacquer, or a print curling at the edges. The surfaces smelled faintly of resin and tobacco, the result of years of mixed use. Even the floorboards seemed to have absorbed the scent, as though the building itself had acquired a mild dependency. For some patrons, the appeal was as much about the environment as the drug. The den offered a contained space where the outside world, with its factory schedules, dockside noise, and moral lectures, seemed briefly irrelevant. Sailors accustomed to cramped bunks might find the low couches almost luxurious. Clerks used to upright chairs might relish the chance to recline without being thought lazy. In that sense, the den was part of a broader economy of escape, no different in spirit from the gin palace or the tea room, except that here the relaxation came not from conversation or caffeine, but from the measured inhalation of vaporized resin. Yet to many Victorians, smoking opium carried a danger that drinking it in laudanum form apparently did not. The latter could be explained away as medicine. One did not take laudanum for pleasure, at least not publicly, even if the effects were the same. Smoking, on the other hand, was difficult to reframe as anything other than indulgence. The paraphernalia alone, the pipe, the lamp, the small tools, suggested a deliberate commitment to the act rather than the casual teaspoon in a glass of sherry. And because the public imagination linked smoking opium to foreignness, it was easy to mark the practice as inherently suspect. It was one thing to dose your child with a soporific when the teething pains grew unbearable. Quite another to be seen disappearing up a narrow staircase off a dockside alley. The truth was that dependency was as possible here as anywhere, though it tended to be slower in the making. Regular smokers might find themselves needing longer sessions or more frequent visits, the relaxation giving way to a dull need, but because the dens were more expensive and less ubiquitous than a chemist's laudanum bottle, most regulars were not smoking daily, unless they were among the minority, who lived or worked in proximity to one. In that sense, the den's biggest threat to public health was perhaps not addiction itself, but the way they fed a comfortable fiction, that the real problem was foreign and contained rather than homegrown and in every medicine cupboard. That fiction was useful to both moralists and authorities. For the former, the den could be held up as a cautionary tale, proof that vice entered the nation through the back door of immigration. For the latter, it provided a ready-made scapegoat that required little in the way of policy changes. Raids did happen, often in response to newspaper campaigns, but they tended to focus on visible, publicized targets, rather than the quieter, less exoticized spaces where opium was used. A police report might note the confiscation of pipes and lamps, the arrest of the proprietor, and the removal of several half-insensible patrons, though the last detail may have owed as much to journalistic flourish as to fact. It was in this gap between perception and reality that the dens took on their peculiar cultural life. They were at once real places and stage sets, functioning businesses and moral symbols. The mere mention of them could lend a novel an air of dangerous authenticity or a parliamentary speech a note of righteous concern. In paintings and illustrations, they were always the same, dim, smoky, faintly perfumed with sin, even if the artist had never been closer to one than the window of his club. And for those who did venture inside, the experience might be memorable, less for its vice than for its ordinariness. A small room, a few strangers, a sweet, resinous smell, and the sound of one's own breath joining the slow rhythm of the others. The end? The den's reputation outstripped their actual influence on Victorian drug culture. Far more people consumed opium in liquid form at home, in quantities that would have astonished the occasional smoker. But the image of the den, smoky, foreign, morally suspect, was simply too good to discard. It provided the perfect foil for respectable society to congratulate itself on its restraint, even as the same society reached for its nightly draft of the very same drug in a different form. And in that quiet hypocrisy lay one of the era's defining contradictions, the tendency to condemn a vice most vigorously when it looked different, smelled unfamiliar, or came with a long pipe instead of a teaspoon. Yet while the moralists clung to their caricatures and the sensation writers polished their scenes, another intoxicant was steadily reshaping daily life. It lacked the theatrical danger of a den, but it came in many forms, powdered, rolled, wrapped, or pressed, and it appealed to almost every social class. The Victorians might not have seen it as a vice, but it filled parlors, clubs, and workshops with its haze all the same. Under the high ceilings of the Victorian drawing room, Tobacco was not merely a habit, it was a declaration. Long before the cigarette butt became the common debris of modern pavements, Britain's relationship with tobacco began in subtler, more ceremonious forms. The aristocratic set still favored snuff, powdered tobacco ground to a fineness that clung to the inside of ornate, hinged boxes. These boxes were not purely utilitarian, they were objets d'art, crafted in silver, tortoiseshell, or gold, sometimes inlaid with enamel or miniature portraits. The act of taking snuff was an entire social performance. A gentleman would flick open the box with a practiced flourish, pinch the blend between forefinger and thumb, inhale sharply, and attempt not to sneeze. A test of self-control that, in polite company, mattered almost as much as the quality of the tobacco itself. The aromas ranged from earthy and leathery to sweetened with floral essences, and one's chosen blend could convey as much about taste and breeding as one's tailor or club membership. In a society obsessed with signs of refinement, even one's method of nasal intoxication was a matter of subtle competition. Snuff had the advantage of discretion. It left no lingering haze in the air, no ash on the hearthrug, no need for a spittoon. This made it suitable for mixed company, at least among the upper classes, where cigars were still largely confined to male-only spaces. Gentlemen's clubs across London were temples to the cigar, vast, carpeted chambers with wingback chairs, arranged in conspiratorial clusters beneath the dim amber light of gas lamps. The air was thick with blue smoke, its slow curls gathering beneath the coffered ceilings, while waiters in black coats moved silently with trays of brandy and fresh ashtrays. These clubs were where power was exchanged as easily as tobacco. Political alliances whispered between puffs, commercial deals sealed over a box of imported Havanas. The smell was rich, almost oily, a mixture of charred leaf and cologne soaked. Into every curtain and waistcoat, members claimed it was the scent of civilization. Their wives tended to call it the scent of stubborn laundry bills. Cigars were expensive, and their cost, like their leisurely burn time, reinforced their exclusivity. A man could spend an hour savoring a single stick, talking little and thinking himself profound, though he was mostly watching the embers creep toward his fingers. To be seen with a cigar was to be marked as someone with both the means and the leisure to waste them. That was precisely the appeal. The same exclusivity kept cigars out of the hands of most working men, though factory owners occasionally provided them to favored foremen as a mark of distinction. For everyone else, cheaper forms of tobacco sufficed, and it was here that the cigarette began its climb. In its early Victorian incarnation, the cigarette was not yet the paper-wrapped ubiquity it would become in the 20th century. At first, cigarettes were hand-rolled, often by the smoker himself, using loose tobacco and flimsy papers that threatened to come apart mid-smoke. They were small, quick-burning, and crucially, affordable. By the 1870s, mechanized production had begun to make them widely available, and the cigarette's convenience, it could be smoked on a short break without leaving much odor, helped. It gained ground among clerks, shopkeepers, and soldiers. Where cigars spoke of patience and position, cigarettes promised efficiency and accessibility. They were, in their way, the industrial revolution of tobacco. Not that everyone was impressed. Among the cigar set, cigarettes were considered vaguely suspect. Too quick, too disposable, too foreign in origin. Snuff-takers looked on both with a kind of weary condescension, as though the fashion for inhaling smoke rather than dust was a regrettable lapse in national taste. But the cigarette's rise was inevitable, fueled not just by its low price, but by its adaptability. Flavored tobaccos appeared, as did pre-packaged brands with distinctive labels that turned into miniature advertisements on every street corner. Soldiers returning from service abroad brought home a taste for the rolled smoke, and young men adopted it as a symbol of modernity, an accessory that could be lit and finished in the time it took to read the evening headlines. The sensory world. A Victorian tobacco was as layered as its social meanings. Snuff carried a dry spice, sometimes with an undernote of bergamot or rose, and lingered in the sinuses in a way that could be oddly comforting. Cigars released a heavy, resinous cloud that settled into clothing and hair, leaving a man perfumed, with his evening's indulgence until he changed his suit. Cigarettes had a sharper tang, especially the cheaper varieties whose tobacco was cut with fillers and flavorings. The smoke bit the back of the throat and left a faint bitterness on the tongue. Whatever the form, tobacco was as much about ritual as it was about intoxication. The preparation, the lighting, the inhale, each step was its own small pleasure, repeated often enough to become automatic. By the late Victorian era, tobacco had become a marker not only of class, but of masculinity itself. Women who smoked were rare and often regarded with suspicion, their habits read as a sign of moral laxity or dangerous independence. There were exceptions, actresses, courtesans, and the occasional society eccentric, but tobacco remained, in the public mind, a male preserve. In this, it mirrored many other intoxicants of the age, which were divided into respectable and questionable, largely along gendered lines. A gentleman could puff a cigar in his club with impunity. A lady might be permitted a discreet sniff of snuff in the privacy of her boudoir, but anything beyond that risked gossip. The business of tobacco was booming. British merchants imported leaf from across the empire, and the manufacturing of snuff, cigars and cigarettes provided steady work in both urban factories and smaller workshops. Advertising began to target specific consumer groups: the rugged imperial adventurer, the urbane man about town, turning tobacco from a mere product into an identity. Shops displayed gleaming humidors and rows of snuff jars with polished brass lids, while tobacconists prided themselves on remembering a regular customer's preferred blend. Tobacco cards, slipped into cigarette packets, began to appear, their colorful illustrations of famous actors, sportsmen, and exotic landscapes adding another layer of appeal to the habit. Of course, there were critics. Early public health reformers warned of tobacco's dangers, though their voices were often drowned out by more pressing Victorian moral crusades. The anti-tobacco arguments were varied. Some claimed it weakened the Constitution, others that it sapped a man's moral fiber, and still others simply found the smell intolerable. But against the tide of habit and commerce, such objections made little headway. Tobacco had embedded itself too firmly in the routines of Victorian life, from the after-dinner cigar to the mid-morning pinch of snuff. In time, the distinctions between the forms would blur. Cigarettes would go on to dominate the next century, while snuff declined and cigars retreated to their strongholds in high society. But in the Victorian moment, all three coexisted, each with its own clientele, rituals, and meanings. Together, they formed a tobacco culture that was at once intensely traditional and quietly adaptive, rooted in old habits, but always ready to accommodate new fashions. Across drawing rooms and dockyards, counting houses and clubs, the scent of tobacco hung in the air, a shared haze linking the empire's many strata, even as it marked their boundaries. And yet, for all its pervasiveness, tobacco remained, in Victorian eyes, a comparatively safe indulgence, one that could be enjoyed in public without scandal, unlike certain foreign imports that carried an altogether different air of danger. If tobacco was the haze that hung over Victorian Britain, absinthe was the exotic green ghost that drifted in from across the Channel, a drink more rumor than reality in British streets, but vivid enough in the public imagination to become a moral hazard without ever being truly common. The drink's origins in the Swiss Jura gave it a respectable medicinal pretext, but by the time it reached the Parisian boulevards, it had already acquired the layers of ritual, style, and scandal that would make it legendary. In Britain, absinthe was far more read about than consumed, its reputation buoyed by reports from travelers, art students, and expatriates who had fallen under its spell in the cafés of Montmartre. Those who returned spoke not just of its taste, but of its theatre, the slow, deliberate process that turned a clear, emerald liquid cloudy as milk and seemed to blur the line between science and sorcery. In Paris, the late afternoon green hour was an institution. Painters, poets, and men with more opinions than income would gather at cafe tables, order their measure of absinthe, and set about the ritual. First came the glass, a tall vessel with a bowl-like reservoir that marked the pour, then the perforated spoon balanced carefully across the rim, holding a single white sugar cube. A carafe of ice water, the colder the better, was placed within reach, and the pourer would begin the slow drip. Each drop struck the sugar, dissolving it grain by grain, sending thin rivulets down into the green liquid below. As the water mixed, the drink underwent its transformation. The deep, jewel-like clarity gave way to a swirling opalescence, a pale green cloud that rolled through the glass like smoke. The result was the louche, a word that in both French and English carried the same suggestion of attractive disreputability. It was a spectacle in miniature, repeated on cafe tables across the city. The sensory impact was as distinctive as the ritual itself. Absinthe's aroma was sharp with anise, the same licorice note that made it polarizing on the first sip. Behind it lay a complex bitterness from wormwood and other botanicals, fennel, hyssop, angelica, melissa, the herbal backbone that gave the drink its medicinal ancestry. On the tongue, it delivered a curious dual sensation, a faint numbing, almost like clove oil, combined with the tingle of the alcohol. It lingered, coating the mouth and altering the perception of whatever came next, a cigarette, a conversation, a passing thought. For the devoted, this was part of the point. Absinthe did not just intoxicate, it reframed. To drink it was to shift the world a degree or two, just enough to let the ordinary seem uncanny. It was this association with altered perception that so endeared absinthe to the bohemian class. Parisian artists, particularly in the latter half of the 19th century, embraced it as both subject and sustenance. Manet painted it, Degas rendered it in a muted haze, Toulouse-Lautrec carried his own specially designed absinthe cane, capable of holding a discreet glassful inside. Writers wove it into their work, Verlaine and Rimbaud drinking it to fuel their fevered poetry, Oscar Wilde describing visions of tulips on the table turning into the heads of men. Whether these accounts were genuine hallucinations or simply the embroidered anecdotes of those eager to shock, they fed the legend. Absinthe became the liquid shorthand for artistic daring, for stepping outside the bounds of polite society into something riskier, more vividly alive. For Victorian moralists, this was precisely the problem. Britain, in the mid to late century, was deeply invested in its self-image as sober, industrious, and morally upright, or at least in maintaining that image in public. Absinthe's reputation on the continent, with its whiff of sexual license, creative chaos, and moral dissolution, made it the perfect object of disapproval. Pamphlets and articles warned of the green curse, citing the drink's alleged capacity to ruin men faster than ordinary spirits. Tales circulated of French soldiers rendered unfit for duty by absinthe, of women in Montmartre lured into ruin under its influence, of entire cafes given over to moral decay under the green shadow. The fact that these stories rarely involved any actual Britons was beside the point. Absinthe could serve as a moral warning without the inconvenience of being a domestic epidemic. The medical press lent its authority to the condemnation. Articles appeared linking absinthe to seizures, madness, and early death, often without distinguishing between heavy absinthe consumption and the effects of chronic alcoholism from other sources. The culprit was said to be thujone, a compound, in wormwood accused of producing hallucinations and neurological damage. While the science was at best speculative, it gave campaigners a chemical villain to point to. In Britain, where the temperance movement already eyed gin palaces and beer halls with suspicion, absinthe was an easy foreign menace to add to the list. Yet despite all this alarm, absinthe never achieved anything like the mass popularity in Britain that it enjoyed in France, Switzerland, or parts of Spain. It was expensive, its flavor was divisive, and the ritual, while enchanting to some, was too elaborate for a public accustomed to ordering a pint or pouring a quick glass of sherry. Absinthe found its British audience mostly among the artistic and literary fringes, particularly those who had spent time abroad. In the salons of certain London circles, it could be produced with a flourish to impress guests, its preparation an excuse for a demonstration of continental sophistication. A few fashionable establishments adopted the green hour as a novelty, though it rarely supplanted the gin and tonic as the evening's preferred opener. When it did appear in Britain, the setting was often part of the point, an artist's studio lit by high windows and smelling faintly of turpentine, a private supper room where the guests were already leaning into their own cultivated eccentricities, a theater after-party where someone, somewhere, had returned from Paris with a taste for the green drink and a desire to be thought daring. The slow drip of water through sugar, the cloudy swirl in the glass, the first sip, all of it performed with a knowing eye to the effect on the audience as much as on the drinker. Even for those who disapproved, absinthe's allure lay partly in its theatricality. It was not like ordering a whiskey, where the glass appeared ready to drink, or like pouring a pint of beer, where the ritual was merely practical. Absinthe was a small ceremony, a performance in which every prop, the glass, the spoon, the sugar, mattered. It could be lingered over, discussed, admired. In this way, absinthe mirrored much of the Victorian taste for ritualized consumption, even as it violated the moral boundaries such rituals were supposed to uphold. As with many imported luxuries, part of absinthe's appeal was its foreignness. It carried the aura of Parisian café life, tables spilling onto boulevards, men in wide-brimmed hats arguing over politics or painting, women in elaborate dresses, whose reputations were ambiguous enough to be interesting. Even those who had never been could picture it. The setting, the smoke, the hum of conversation, the clink of glass and spoon. In Britain, where public life was governed by a stricter etiquette, this imagined bohemia held a certain magnetic pull for those who found the rigidity of home life stifling. Over time, the British conversation about absinthe began to echo that of other imported vices. It was spoken of with the same mixture of fascination and moral disapproval that had once greeted coffee, tea, and tobacco themselves, though in absinthe's case, the moral warnings were never softened by mass adoption. By the dawn of the 20th century, absinthe's notoriety was waning in France under the weight of its own moral panic, culminating in bans in several countries. In Britain, the drink faded back into obscurity, remembered less for its actual effects than for the fears and fantasies it had inspired. For the Victorians who embraced it, absinthe was never just about intoxication. It was about atmosphere, about stepping into a different set of rules for an hour or two. It was a drink that promised, if not actual visions, then at least the illusion of heightened perception, the sense that the ordinary world might be lit differently, colored more vividly if seen through a faint green glass. But to those who warned against it, that was exactly the danger. Anything that could make the commonplace seem extraordinary, they feared, could also make the moral boundaries of the everyday seem less absolute. And so, absinthe's legacy in Victorian Britain was not one of widespread ruin or cultural transformation, but of a persistent idea that somewhere across the channel there was a drink that could change the way you saw the world, if only for a little while. Whether that change was liberation or corruption depended entirely on who was telling the story. In either case, the tale was compelling enough to ensure that absinthe, in all its emerald mystery, would linger in the British imagination long after its brief and limited fashion had passed. Just as absinthe carried with it a whiff of continental sophistication, and for moralists, a cautionary tang of foreign decadence, another intoxicant was making its way into Britain. But this one arrived not draped in the romance of café life, nor burdened with the superstitions of herbal lore. Instead, it came packaged in the confidence of the modern age, in bottles, in powders, in lozenges stamped with scientific respectability. Cocaine, the marvel of chemistry, was ready to take its turn. Few substances arrived with the same air of scientific triumph as cocaine. It was the very image of modernity. Not a crude plant resin from the colonies, nor a pungent spirit distilled behind swinging tavern doors, but a refined crystalline powder isolated and bottled by clever men in waistcoats and wire-rimmed spectacles. For doctors who had spent their careers dosing patients with things that worked mostly by knocking them unconscious, cocaine seemed almost magical. It was said to restore energy, sharpen the mind, soothe the stomach, and even strengthen the nerves. The fact that it accomplished this largely by telling the nervous system to run in frantic little circles was not yet a matter of professional concern. In an age when exhaustion was considered as much a moral failing as a physical one, the promise of a substance that could turn a weary clerk into a tireless one was intoxicating in itself. You could find it in any number of agreeable forms. Chemists stocked neat little vials of the pure powder for those who preferred the brisk approach. For the less direct, there was coca wine, imported from France and marketed as a tonic for everything, from sluggish digestion to the blues. Its advertisements showed vigorous men and women mid-stride, cheeks glowing, posture upright. Not a hint of the slack-eyed torpor associated with the more disreputable intoxicants. Cocaine lozenges were sold for sore throats, as if the patient's main ailment was being insufficiently talkative. Most beguiling of all was its role in toothache drops, dispensed freely to children whose mothers were assured that a numbed jaw would be much easier to manage than a crying one. The drops did more than soothe the gums. They left the child suddenly bright-eyed and untroubled by the need for sleep, which was presented as a mark of their restored vitality. The sensory signature of cocaine and its gentler delivery systems was less about flavor than about sensation. A sip of coca wine was sweet at first, but carried a faint medicinal sharpness, like the shadow of quinine. Then the numbing began. A peculiar, cooling bloom that started on the tongue and crept inward until the mouth felt both alive and detached, as though it had been reassigned to a slightly faster body. Within minutes came the clarity. Colors appeared. Crisper, sounds more distinct, and the sluggish minutes of a dreary afternoon began to move with a purpose. It was not the blurry warmth of opium, nor the rolling burn of gin, but a precise, glassy stimulation that promised competence. If laudanum whispered that you could rest, cocaine announced that you could do anything, preferably right now, and preferably all of it at once. Part of its allure lay in its respectability. A cocaine tonic, neatly labeled and tucked into a gentleman's pocket, looked no different from a bottle of digestive bitters or patent cough syrup. It could be sipped in an office, in a train carriage, or during an afternoon visit without raising an eyebrow. Unlike opium dens, which were linked in the public mind with shadowy foreign quarters and moral decay, cocaine lived in the open, in shop windows, on polite drawing-room side tables, in the pages of medical journals. It was an intoxicant you could admit to taking without fearing that someone might assume you'd thrown in your lot with sailors or gamblers. Even the more flamboyant users, like certain society hostesses who swore by a drop before a dinner party, did not tarnish its reputation. Their chatter and bright eyes were taken as signs of wit, not warning. Of course, the other reason no one worried much was that no one had yet linked its more unnerving effects with the substance itself. Sleeplessness could be chalked up to an active mind, irritability to a quick temper, the sudden conviction that one could reorganize the entire household linen press at 3 a.m. to simple industriousness. Doctors might note that a patient's nerves seemed unusually strained, but the idea that the tonic meant to repair them was in fact sawing away at them from the inside was too contrary to the era's faith in modern pharmacology. And so, the bottles continued to move, one after another, from the chemist's shelf to the home medicine cabinet, their labels promising an end to fatigue in the same calm lettering used to advertise cough drops. It was only toward the turn of the century that murmurs of doubt began to reach the public ear. Medical reports spoke of overuse in cautious tones, though the definition of overuse was vague enough to let most customers consider themselves moderate. Popular fiction, always quicker to sense a moral opportunity, began to feature the occasional character whose enthusiasm for his coca tonic led to financial or social ruin, though these were usually cast as individual failings rather than symptoms of a wider issue. But by then, cocaine had already left its mark, not just on the nerves of its users, but on the Victorian faith in the chemist's jar as the solution to all ills. If the age could be accused of anything, it was of trusting that every problem could be met with the correct mixture of powders and liquids. Cocaine fit neatly into this belief, offering a kind of alchemy that turned fatigue into efficiency and worry into the calm conviction that nothing was beyond one's capacity. It was the intoxicant of modern ambition, bottled in clear glass, stoppered, tight, and sold over the counter to anyone with a shilling and the will to keep going. And if medicine could lift the spirits and sharpen the mind so effectively, it could just as easily send a person in the opposite direction, down into the comfortable darkness of unconsciousness, sometimes by accident, and sometimes in the name of entertainment. This brings us to the curious Victorian fondness for ether and chloroform parties, where the medical was not so much reimagined as gleefully abused. Ether and chloroform, meant to steal the thrashing of patients under the knife, somehow drifted from the operating theatre to the drawing room, lecture hall, and, most memorably, the university dormitory. Their journey was helped along by a general Victorian faith in the civilizing influence of science. If something had been introduced by a respected surgeon in a white apron, then surely it could be tinkered with, repurposed, and passed around at gatherings without offending either good taste or common sense. Ether, in particular, had the advantage of a dramatic and immediate effect. A whiff could tip a person from perfect composure into helpless laughter in seconds, the sort of abrupt change that is inherently funny to anyone not currently undergoing it. Chloroform was slower but more theatrical, a folded handkerchief pressed over the nose and mouth, a deep breath, a visible slackening of the jaw, and the subject was gone to a world from which they might re-emerge with the puzzled dignity of someone waking on the wrong train. These qualities made them irresistible to certain university clubs, amateur science groups, and idle bands of the comfortably bored. Evenings might be spent timing how long it took a man to keel over or challenging one another to recite poetry, until the last possible moment before the words dissolved into giggles. The experience itself was not subtle. Ether arrived in a pungent wave, its vapors catching in the nose and throat with a sharp chemical tang, then flooding the head with a light, dizzying warmth. Sound seemed to stretch and warp, a friend's voice turning into something both unreasonably hilarious and impossibly far away, while the edges of the room took on a curious blur. For some, the effect was pure exhilaration, a sense of unshakable cheerfulness, as though every petty annoyance had been gently filed away. For others, it was simply a brief, lurching slide into blackout, after which they would wake on a settee with their hair at odd angles and the faint conviction that something very funny had happened, though they couldn't say what. Chloroform, by contrast, had a velvety heaviness to it, a smooth descent rather than a chaotic tumble, but its endpoint was much the same, an unceremonious collapse into temporary nothingness. To outside observers, particularly those of the same class and educational background, such behavior was not met with outrage, but with a kind of indulgent amusement. These were not gin-soaked dock workers rolling in the gutter. These were the sons of doctors, lawyers, and landowners, indulging in high spirits under the thin shield of scientific curiosity. A newspaper might note a chloroform incident at a college with a wink rather than a wagged finger, framing it as a harmless experiment gone slightly sideways. In some circles, participating in, or at least tolerating such stunts was practically a rite of passage. One could say that ether and chloroform occupied the same social space as impromptu amateur theatricals or ill-advised climbing of public statues, not quite respectable, but hardly the stuff to ruin a young man's prospects. That is not to say there were no mishaps. Occasionally, a party guest would breathe too deeply and too long, requiring vigorous shaking, or, in one memorable case reported in a provincial paper, immersion in a horse trough to bring them round. There were rumors, some substantiated, many not, of teeth broken in sudden falls, spectacles bent beyond repair, and unfortunate encounters with fireplace grates while sliding toward the floor. These were generally filed under the heading of unfortunate but instructive, rather than fatal flaws in judgment. The Victorians, after all, were adept at reframing calamity as anecdote, particularly when it happened to people they already considered sound and upstanding. The choice between ether and chloroform was often a matter of availability rather than taste. Ether could be distilled with relative ease by those with access to the right equipment, a fact that ensured its presence in certain chemistry classrooms long after the official lesson had ended. Chloroform, requiring a bit more skill and some less than common ingredients, was more often purchased, sometimes under the thinnest of pretenses. Either way, the actual exchange was rarely tense. Apothecaries were accustomed to supplying their clients with alarming substances, and the boundary between medicinal use and recreation was hazy enough that few felt compelled to draw a hard line. Women were, officially at least, absent from these gatherings, the prevailing belief being that fainting in the parlor was quite different from voluntarily knocking oneself senseless in front of a room full of peers. Yet this did not prevent the occasional clandestine participation. Diaries from the period contain hints, a mention of an unusual cheer at tea or a peculiar headache from visiting the laboratory, that suggest some women were just as curious and just as capable of enjoying the brief voyage into chemical oblivion. It is unlikely, however, that their experiments were met with the same indulgent laughter as the men's. The line between high spirits and scandalous behavior was always more sharply drawn for women. The moral arbiters of the day were oddly restrained in their condemnation of ether and chloroform parties. This may have been because the substances lacked the moral baggage of alcohol, opium, or even tobacco. They were not associated with vice-ridden neighborhoods or disreputable foreigners, but with antiseptic hospital corridors and the noble work of surgery. A man might stagger about under the influence of ether and still be described as merely foolish, whereas the same display after brandy could mark him as dangerously intemperate. It was, in a sense, a loophole in the great Victorian campaign for sobriety, a way to experience intoxication without technically crossing the line into drunkenness. That this loophole occasionally resulted in bruises, burns, and the occasional unplanned nap in the coal scuttle was largely beside the point. What mattered was that it fit within the social framework, a temporary lapse conducted among one's peers, leaving no lasting mark except perhaps a lingering chemical odor in the drapes. In the peculiar arithmetic of Victorian propriety, it was possible to collapse unconscious on the parlor carpet and still be thought of as a gentleman, so long as the cause was a bottle from the chemist rather than the public house. This practice was not universal. Access to ether or chloroform required either money, connections, or a certain amount of education, and so it remained a largely middle and upper-class amusement. The working classes had their own route to intoxication. One that relied on neither formal education nor discreet apothecaries. It was cheaper, often stronger, and vastly more hazardous. In the cramped courts and narrow back streets of industrial towns, drink was not always purchased ready-made from a public house. Much of it was produced in sheds, back kitchens, or cellars, in contraptions cobbled together from whatever could be salvaged. The goal was not refinement, it was strength, quantity, and above all, affordability. When the week's wages had to stretch between rent, food, and fuel, there was little left over for pleasures, unless those pleasures could be manufactured at home for a fraction of the cost. Home brewing had been a tradition for centuries, but the Victorian urban version had a certain improvised ferocity to it. Where a rural household might take pride in a well-tended barrel of ale flavored with carefully chosen hops, the city equivalent often relied on whatever grain, sugar, or fermentable matter could be had cheaply, regardless of quality. Sourness was common, bitterness almost guaranteed, and the haze in the liquid might have been the yeast working its final hours, or something more sinister from the brewing vessel itself. Barrels were reused far past the point of sanitation. Vats were scrubbed irregularly, if at all, and water was drawn from pumps of uncertain purity. Yet these rough ales and beers were drunk without hesitation, partly because they were familiar, and partly because they could be made in sufficient quantity to keep the drinker's head pleasantly swimming for the evening. The drive to make drinks, stronger, however, encouraged ventures into spirits, a far more treacherous undertaking in the confines of a tenement yard. Distillation required heat, vessels that could withstand pressure, and coils of pipe for cooling vapor back into liquid. It also required a certain confidence that the neighbors would not object to the strange smells, or worse, the occasional bang when an improvised still met its limit. Those who mastered the process could produce liquor potent enough to stop conversation mid-sentence, but rarely did it come without a price. The raw spirit, often distilled without care for the finer points of chemistry, might contain enough fusel oils to make the tongue feel thick and the head pound for days. Worse still, careless methods could leave traces of lead from soldered joints or a metallic tang from rusting pipes, contamination that did not merely cause a hangover, but could blind or kill. Adulteration was another hazard. Even purchased spirits were not immune to tampering, and when profit margins were razor-thin, unscrupulous sellers might stretch their stock with whatever seemed vaguely compatible with alcohol. Watering down was the least of it. More troubling were additions meant to mimic the bite of strong drink, sulfuric acid in small doses, capsicum for heat, or even turpentine for its sharp, thinner-like edge. Some colorless industrial spirits found their way into the mix, their origins unacknowledged and their effects disastrous. A clear liquid in a reused gin bottle might burn in the throat just as convincingly as the genuine article, but it might also strip the lining from the stomach or cause the vision to cloud into permanent darkness. Flavor was a secondary consideration, but it was there, often unwelcome and impossible to disguise entirely. A sip of backyard gin might carry a faint soapy note from poorly rinsed containers, or the oily aftertaste of a batch in which the heavier fractions of the distillate had been left in. Beer from an alleyway barrel might greet the drinker with an initial yeasty freshness before resolving into a sour tang that clung to the teeth. The metallic edge of contaminated water or rusted fittings could be masked with strong spices but never wholly banished. Those accustomed to such drinks accepted these notes as part of the experience, their palates trained to associate them with the warmth that followed. The economics behind all this were blunt. A gallon of home-brewed beer might cost a fraction of what the public house charged, and the savings multiplied. If one could distill spirits from discarded mash or surplus grain, even when ingredients had to be bought, they were often of the cheapest grade available, molasses instead of sugar, sweepings from mill floors instead of fresh barley. Labor was free, provided by whoever could be spared from other work for the hours it took to mind the pot or stir the ferment. In many cases, these brews were not just for personal consumption, but for quiet sale to neighbors, each transaction conducted with a careful glance toward the street to ensure no constable was near. There was also an element of pride in producing. Drink at home, though it was of a different character than the genteel satisfaction of a country house brewing its own cider. Here, it was about self-reliance and resourcefulness, about outwitting both the taxman and the publican. In a world where much of life was controlled by employers, landlords, and local authorities, making one's own drink, however rough, could feel like reclaiming a small measure of independence. It was a quiet defiance, served in chipped mugs and cloudy bottles. Inevitably, accidents and illnesses resulted, but they were often folded into the general hazards of working-class life. A man blinded by a bad batch of gin was unfortunate, yes, but hardly more so than the one crushed by falling timber at the docks or laid low by fever in a damp cellar room. Coroner's inquests might note the presence of adulterated spirits in a death, but such findings rarely led to any real enforcement unless the incident was particularly public or scandalous. Most often, the lesson, if it could be called that, was simply to buy from a different neighbor next time or to be more careful with the heat on the still. The sensory world of these brews was far removed from the polished decanters of the middle classes. The air of a brewing space carried a dense, yeasty fug, tinged with the sweetness of fermenting grain and the sharper notes of spilled alcohol soaking into wood. A freshly poured mug might foam enthusiastically, then settle to reveal a murky body with flecks suspended in the liquid. Spirits poured from an unlabeled bottle might sparkle faintly in the light, but a cautious sniff could reveal the oily heaviness beneath, the sort that clung stubbornly to the back of the throat. Even the act of drinking was different, less a matter of measured sips and more of bracing oneself for the swallow than waiting for the heat to bloom in the chest. Despite the dangers, the trade in such brews endured, partly because it filled a gap that neither temperance societies nor commercial breweries could. The former offered moral lectures and tea, the latter offered drink at a price that many could not meet regularly. Backyard chemistry, for all its hazards, was accessible, immediate and in a sense democratic. It could be shared freely among friends, traded for favors, or sold cheaply enough to keep even the poorest supplied with a measure of comfort at the week's end. By the close of the century, reformers and public health officials had begun to take more notice of these practices, but their efforts to stamp them out met with mixed results. Raids on illicit stills were often as much a spectacle for the local press as a genuine deterrent, the confiscated apparatus displayed like trophies in station windows. Fines were imposed, equipment was smashed, but within weeks, another still would be bubbling quietly in a different yard. The cycle was as predictable as the Saturday night gatherings that gave rise to it. For those on the outside, reading about these brews in temperance pamphlets or hearing about them in Parliament, it was easy to see only recklessness and vice. For those on the inside, they were simply part of the fabric of life, as ordinary as a pawnshop ticket or a cracked kettle on the hob. The risk was real, the taste often unpleasant, but the warmth it brought was immediate, and the means of obtaining it lay within reach of anyone with a little ingenuity. By the time the century's middle decades rolled in, the Victorian appetite for strong drink and stronger remedies had been noticed by those with a knack for turning profit from human frailty. The men, and occasionally women, who stocked apothecary shelves and newspaper advertising columns, understood two things very well. First, that the average householder would rather take a small draught of something sweet than endure the tedium of prolonged discomfort. And second, that if one could deliver a sense of relief wrapped in the trappings of medical respectability, no one would ask too many awkward questions about the exact contents of the bottle. From this union of need and opportunity emerged the patent medicine industry, a glittering theater of health in which the stage props happened to contain enough alcohol or narcotics to sedate a farmhand. Unlike the illicit backyard stills and kitchen experiments that characterized working-class brewing, patent medicines came swaddled in the velvet of respectability. Their bottles bore embossed lettering, floral embossing, and labels in flowing copperplate fonts that promised everything from rapid relief of nervous exhaustion to invigorated constitutions. They were displayed proudly in chemists' windows alongside hair tonics and imported soaps, often lit by the new gas lamps to lend an extra halo of credibility. They were patent in the sense of being proprietary, although in practice very few were actually patented. This proprietary air implied that someone, somewhere, had subjected the mixture to a rigorous process of invention, refinement, and possibly divine revelation. It was marketing as alchemy, transforming opium tincture into a symbol of modern progress. Inside, the recipes were alarmingly familiar. Alcohol was the backbone, sometimes making up more than half the volume, ensuring that even the most delicate lady could find herself slightly flushed and rather cheerful by the bottom of a teacup. Opium appeared in many guises: laudanum, morphia, paregoric, lending a smooth, soporific undercurrent to the sweetness. Cocaine, that new darling of the scientific set, was occasionally added for its bracing qualities, resulting in an effect not unlike being both soothed and sharpened at once. To the uninitiated, it felt miraculous. The headache receded, the mood lifted, and one's ability to endure the day lengthened considerably. To those more familiar with chemistry, it was simply the predictable outcome of being mildly drunk, mildly high, and mildly numb in quick succession. The range of ailments these bottles claimed to treat bordered on the heroic, female hysteria, that catch-all diagnosis for any combination of anxiety, melancholy, or irritation, was a perennial favorite, as was nervous weakness in men who had the misfortune to work long hours under gaslight. There were lung tonics for persistent coughs, stomach bitters for indigestion, meaning anything from heartburn to existential despair, and children's syrups for teething pains. The last category was perhaps the most dangerous, as mothers were, encouraged to view the resulting slack-jawed slumber not as a symptom of opiate sedation, but as blessed relief for both parent and child. An infant rendered docile by morphine was, after all, far easier to manage while one attended to the laundry. In keeping with Victorian sensibilities, the act of consuming these substances was couched in rituals that preserved the appearance of moderation. A spoonful of tonic could be stirred into a cup of tea, where its alcohol base blended neatly with the tannins, allowing the drinker to appear as though they were simply fortifying themselves with a mid-afternoon refreshment. Some tonics were taken in tiny cordial glasses, the better to frame the dose as a genteel indulgence rather than a creeping dependency. The bottles themselves were often kept in the parlor cabinet or the sideboard, nestled between the sherry decanter and the good china, as if they too were to be brought out for polite company. Advertising was the lifeblood of the trade. Newspapers and periodicals carried columns of vivid testimonials, allegedly penned by grateful customers whose lives had been transformed by Dr. Brightwell's restorative elixir or Mrs. Lanford's celebrated tonic. These testimonials were suspiciously well punctuated, often describing recoveries from conditions so vague and wide-ranging that one might suspect the patient had been reincarnated, rather than merely restored. The accompanying illustrations showed ruddy-cheeked matrons and upright gentlemen, all of whom radiated the robust health that could apparently be obtained in 4 days with a few shillings and a trustworthy stomach. The law, such as it was, offered little interference. Labeling requirements were minimal, and there was no obligation to list active ingredients, as long as one refrained from making outright fraudulent medical claims, a flexible concept in itself. The sale of potent medicines was perfectly legal. Even where the addictive properties of such products were recognized, they were often framed as evidence of the medicine's efficacy rather than a cause for alarm. A tonic that one wished to take daily was, from the seller's perspective, the mark of a satisfied customer. This is not to say that the Victorian public was entirely naive. There were murmurs in certain circles, medical journals, temperance meetings, the occasional parliamentary speech, that perhaps it was unwise to have half the nation's household stocked with bottles that could render their owners tipsy, insensible, or chemically dependent. Temperance activists, already suspicious of anything with an alcohol content, lumped patent medicines into their campaigns alongside gin and ale. However, their earnest warnings were often drowned out by the chorus of satisfied users and the far louder voice of commerce. For every sermon denouncing the creeping curse of the cordial, there were a dozen shop windows cheerfully offering it at 2 shillings a bottle. The human stories behind these tonics were as varied as the bottles themselves. Clerks with persistent coughs kept a vial in their desk drawers, dosing themselves between ledgers. Elderly widows took a spoonful each evening to settle the nerves, drifting into sleep with the comfort of its slow burn in the chest. Labourers' wives used it sparingly, or not so sparingly, on days when their joints ached from washing and scrubbing. Some households treated the tonic bottle as a seasonal accessory, fetched out in winter for colds and stored away in summer. Others made it a permanent fixture, the glass slowly clouded from years of being refilled from the same shop. One of the more peculiar features of this culture was the polite fiction that addiction was something that happened to other people, the lower orders, foreigners, or those with some inherent moral weakness. If one was of respectable standing, any regular use of potent medicines was simply an indication of one's delicate constitution or one's need for a little help to maintain the demands of social and domestic life. The idea that dependency could bloom in the parlor every bit as easily as in an East End opium den was simply too uncomfortable to entertain. In truth, many Victorian lives unfolded under the influence of these bottled comforts. The morning might begin with a digestive tonic to counter the heaviness of a poorly ventilated night, the afternoon punctuated by a spoonful of something for the nerves, and the evening rounded off with a cordial to ensure a full night's rest. By the standards of the day, this was simply prudent self-care, and if one found oneself unable to forego the evening dose, well, that was a matter for private reflection, not public admission. If there was any humor to be found in this arrangement, it was in the earnest way Victorians insisted on distinguishing between drinking and taking one's medicine, even when the latter involved a higher proof than the former. A man who poured himself a glass of gin at 2 in the afternoon might be judged a hopeless case. The same man pouring himself a brimming measure of Reverend Dr. Wainwright's tonic for vigor was a model of sensible precaution. It was, in effect, the perfect loophole. Intoxication in a teacup, respectable by label, if not by effect. And so the trade flourished, filling not only the pockets of its proprietors but also the cabinets, sideboards, and stomachs of a nation, already well accustomed to fortifying itself against the cold, the damp, and the indignities of modern life. Whether one truly believed in the curative powers of the syrup was almost beside the point. The ritual of taking it, the measured pour, the familiar sweetness, the slow, warming spread, became an end in itself, a small daily ceremony that blurred the line between necessity and indulgence. It is perhaps unsurprising, then, that when the century's next wave of reformers began cataloguing the many ways Victorians managed to alter their minds, they found no shortage of material. They might have expected to unearth secrets hidden in back alleys or behind the curtains of smoky dens, but instead, they found half the country's kitchens, parlors, and even nurseries stocked with bottles whose contents were every bit as potent as anything sold under the counter. Respectability, it seemed, was less a matter of what one consumed than how prettily it was labeled. And yet, for all the hand-wringing and occasional bursts of moral indignation, the reality was that patent medicines had woven themselves too deeply into the fabric of daily life to be easily extracted. They had become part of the rhythm, a dose after breakfast, a spoonful before bed, a cordial when the weather turned damp. To remove them entirely would have been to unravel not just habits, but a whole system of domestic comfort. From the glass-fronted cabinets of the middle classes to the crowded shelves of the corner chemist, these bottled cures stood as silent witnesses to a society that could preach temperance in the abstract while quietly dosing itself into docility. And if that irony registered with anyone at the time, it was quickly drowned in the familiar syrupy sweetness, the pleasant fog that followed, and the shared understanding that some discomforts were best met not with stoicism, but with a little something in the teacup. For all the moral hand-wringing over gin, opium, and patent medicines, Victorian Britain had no difficulty embracing certain stimulants, so long as they arrived with the proper cultural packaging. If your intoxicant could be poured from a porcelain teapot and served on a lace tablecloth, you were safe from the sermons and the illustrated cautionary pamphlets. Indeed, you might even be congratulated for your discernment. And so, the nation's most socially unimpeachable highs came not from the chemist's bottle or the public house's tap, but from the china cups of tea, coffee, and cocoa that graced drawing rooms, railway refreshment counters, and the worn kitchen tables of terrace houses. These drinks managed the neat trick of altering mood and physiology, while preserving an aura of moral cleanliness. Tea was the undisputed sovereign of this realm, reigning over both the upper and lower orders, with a quiet authority that Parliament itself might have envied. Imported from the far reaches of the empire, India, Ceylon, China, tea was freighted, not just in wooden chests, but in the rhetoric of domestic virtue. A respectable household might run short of meat, sugar, or coal without serious damage to its standing, but to be without tea was to flirt with social ruin. In genteel homes, the teapot was a centerpiece, often silver-plated and engraved with matching cups and saucers thin enough that you could see the shadow of your finger through the porcelain. In working-class dwellings, the vessel might be a chipped brown pot, and the leaves reused until the liquor resembled a weak apology, but the ritual was no less firmly observed. It was, after all, cheaper than beer, safer than water, and in sufficient quantities, could leave you with the sort of soft, sustained alertness that made another hour at the mangle or the ledger feel just about bearable. The sensory theatre of tea was a thing in itself. The hiss of the kettle, the faint clink of the lid as it was lifted, the earthy, sweet fragrance of leaves opening in hot water. All this preceded the actual drinking, which arrived with the warmth of the cup between your palms and the first cautious sip. Strong tea could deliver a kick not unlike a discreet slap, snapping the mind into focus, while weaker brews carried a comfort that blurred the edge off hunger. The tannins dried the tongue slightly, the caffeine steadied the pulse, and before long, you could convince yourself that the day was moving along quite nicely. There were, of course, warnings about overindulgence, physicians who claimed that excessive tea drinking weakened the nerves, moralists who worried about women gossiping too freely under its influence. But compared to the charges leveled against gin or laudanum, these were the complaints of a faintly disapproving aunt, rather than an outraged magistrate. If tea was the queen, coffee was the ambitious cousin with a foreign accent and a whiff of scandal. It had been known in Britain for centuries, but in the Victorian era, it found a renewed role as the drink of the cosmopolitan. Coffee houses of the 18th century had been hotbeds of political debate, but the 19th century shifted the drink into more genteel venues. Middle-class families kept small brass or tin coffee pots, sometimes with grinders that turned the morning into a minor athletic event. The wealthy imported exotic beans from the West Indies or Arabia, advertised in newspapers with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for patent elixirs. Coffee offered a sharper, more immediate stimulus than tea, a sudden lift in the mind, a briskness in the limbs, and for some, a jittery after-edge that suggested one had slightly overestimated one's constitution. Its bitterness was part of the appeal, the flavor of brisk dealings and purposeful mornings. In London, cafes began to cater to travelers and businessmen, their interiors often furnished with bentwood chairs, marble-topped tables, and the steady rattle of cups on saucers. If tea was the language of home, coffee spoke of movement, commerce, and the faintly exotic promise of life elsewhere. The steam rising from a freshly poured cup carried the scent of roasted beans, a dark, earthy aroma that could feel both grounding and stimulating at once. A spoonful of sugar might tame the edge, though purists dismissed this as a dilution of character, a phrase they also applied to people who drank only tea. Cocoa, meanwhile, was the moralist's darling, the drink temperance. Societies could promote without blushing. A hot, nourishing alternative to the demon drink, firms like Cadbury, Fry, and Rowntree positioned cocoa as a wholesome, family-friendly beverage full of virtue and, if you overlooked the sugar content, health. Their advertisements depicted glowing children, contented mothers, and beaming patriarchs, all united by the civilizing influence of the cocoa pot. In reality, cocoa was not entirely without stimulation. It carried its own gentle dose of theobromine and caffeine, enough to soften fatigue and sharpen mood without tipping anyone into scandal. The preparation of cocoa had its own choreography, the measured spooning of powder into a jug, the addition of hot milk or water, the vigorous stirring to disperse stubborn clumps, and finally, the sweet aroma that promised comfort in liquid form. In working-class kitchens, cocoa was sometimes made thin and stretched to serve many, while in better-off homes, it might be enriched with extra cream and sugar, becoming almost a dessert in itself. The taste was smooth, slightly bitter beneath. Its sweetness and the warmth worked its way from the mouth down through the chest, unfurling a small but distinct sense of well-being. What all three drinks had in common was their ability to stimulate without transgressing. They were taken in, company, at table, in the open light of day. A teapot on a tray could enter any room without raising eyebrows. A coffee service could be offered to a visiting clergyman without risk. A cup of cocoa could be handed to a child at bedtime without a single letter to the editor. They also came wrapped in empire, the plantations, the shipping lines, the trading companies, though this was seldom dwelt upon in polite conversation. The leaves, beans, and pods arrived as if by magic, their colonial origins politely veiled by the ceremony of serving.